Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out to the Wannsee on this truly gorgeous evening where we can all appreciate what this lake really looks like, not shrouded by clouds all the time. My name's RJ McGill. I'm the head of communications here at the American Academy and the editor of our Berlin Journal. I'm glad to welcome you tonight to Christina's lecture, The Breath Archives, Affective Documents, Collective Memory, and the Afterlives of Femicide. Christina is this semester's Holtzbrinck Fellow, and it must be noted, the current darling of the publishing world for her new book, Liliana's Invincible Summer, A Sister's Search for Justice, which came out at the end of February. And you had a party. Her fellows threw her a party with a cake that looked like the book. It was really impressive. I'm just going to say a few words about the Holtzbrinck Fellowship and about Sylvia Furman, who will be introducing Christina, and then I'll hand the floor over. The Academy's Holtzbrinck Fellowship was established in 1999 with the generous support of the Holtzbrinck Publishing Group, with the express goal of promoting German-American dialogue in the fields of journalism, fiction, and scholarship. We're grateful to the Holtzbrinck family for their continuing support, and in particular, the Academy's longstanding trustee and current vice chairman, Stefan von Holtzbrinck, who his generosity makes so many things possible at the Academy, it's impossible to count, including underwriting each issue of the Berlin Journal, which its editor finds incredibly humbling. Thank you, Stefan. Over the years, the Academy's Holtzbrinck Fellowship has made it possible for outstanding American academics, journalists, and writers to come to the Academy as fellows, among them Alex Ross, Hilton Als, Jonathan Safran Foer, Anne Hull, Nicole Krauss, Sigrid Nunez, George Packer, and David Troyer, among many others, including tonight's speaker, Cristina Rivera Garza. Cristina will be introduced by Sylvia Furman, who is the director of the DAAD Artists in Berlin program. Sylvia studied literature and linguistics in her hometown of Buenos Aires, and since then has been active in the fields of journalism, translation, and cultural management. She taught at the University of Buenos Aires and was later stationed in New York City as a cultural correspondent for the Argentinian news magazine Debate. Before the DAAD, where she began in 2018, she was head of communications at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, where she also oversaw the program in cultural education and, most importantly, was the institution's deputy director. In Berlin, Sylvia is the spokesperson as well for the Rat für Künste, Rat für die Künste Berlin, and is a member of the city's Historical Advisory Council. Sylvia, it's a pleasure to have you with us tonight. A few housekeeping notes, how the sort of evening will play out here. Christina's talk will run for about 40 minutes, followed by an audience Q&A, which will be moderated here, and they'll sit here together. If you're with us at the Academy, please just raise your hand and a microphone will find you. If you're joining us on Zoom, please type your question into the Q&A part of the Zoom platform. And with that, Sylvia, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. I've spent the day in a jury meeting without access to internet, so I'm moving around with this clumsy computer, so I apologize. I have to go to just open my file, and then I'm ready. Buenas noches. Hello. Thank you, Jay, for your kind words. I've typed my password right, so nothing can go wrong, I hope. So, thank you for your kind introduction. There have been, again and again, communicating vessels between our two organizations, but I'm particularly delighted to be invited to introduce you to Cristina Rivera Garza. In view of her impressive CV, I've decided that I will not enumerate her many achievements, recurring instead, for the sake of time economy, to a Latin expression that I loved learning in every language I learned, but it works in every language, which is non solum autem sedet, not only but. Cristina Rivera Garza is not only an outstanding scholar widely known in the academic world, but also a foremost voice in contemporary Latin American literature. She has published at least 35 books, if I count well, and here again, not only theory and essays, but also short stories, novels, and poetry. She does not only write and translate, but has developed cross-genre collaborations with composers and artists. She's not only an historian, but also trained in sociology, and I could go on for longer with not only that, no solo sino también. But then there is also a dimension of non plus ultra. She's the only author to have twice won the International Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz Award, which is for female writers in Spanish surely a very nice award, because Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz was the first public intellectual producing in Spanish in her time. If I may add, on a more humble note, she's the only author to have got a fellowship by the American Academy and the DAD Artists in Berlin program in the same year. Having Christina in Berlin for a year and a half is in itself a delightful outlook. She's going to stay at the DAD Artists in Berlin program from September on. So in case you want to keep track of her public conversations, join our newsletter. If I may add on a personal note, as a literary scholar trained in Argentina and working in Germany, I find it particularly inspiring to start Christina's public conversation in Berlin tonight at the American Academy. And this is a personal remark. In the 19th and 20th centuries, America was a mode of political imagination that encompassed North and South, the US and Latin America. It was the Americas. Of course, this is a very complicated story, full of exclusions and misunderstandings and problems, and we could spend a whole evening discussing this idea of the Americas. But if there is the possibility of a community of thought and practice that encompasses the two modes of America, then Cristina Rivera Garza is for sure a public intellectual both at home in the United States of America as in Latin America. And this is a wonderful start for a conversation. So join me in welcoming Cristina Rivera Garza on stage. Thank you. Here we go.
And Silvia. All right. Well, buenas noches, Berlin. Good evening, American Academy in Berlin. I'm really happy to see all of you in here. I, of course, have to start by saying thank you so many times. I'm very thankful about the weather, as you said, Jay. I'm very thankful for the weather, but I'm also thankful for a number of things which I want to enumerate right now. Thank you to the American Academy in Berlin for the generous hospitality. It's been a very productive and a rather enjoyable couple of months, more than a couple of months in here, so thank you so much. And thank you to every member of the various teams working in this institution. And I'm talking about those working in the guest services, people working at the kitchen, librarians who have been incredibly helpful throughout this stay, organizers of the events. Thank you so much. You've made my life very enjoyable these days. Much easier too, by the way. And obviously, I want to mention my dear fellows, people, writers, academics, with whom I have shared meals, endless conversations, and some dancing too. So not bad for my first stay in Berlin. Thank you for the introduction, Silvia, as well. I'm looking forward to that year. Continuing my stay here in Berlin later this year. Okay, I'm going to be reading, touching upon this book that was published, was out in late February, and then I hope we can have a conversation right here. The Breath Archives. Yeah, it's working. Good. On July 16th, 1990, Liliana Rivera Garza, my younger and only sister, was victim of femicide at the hands of Ángel González Ramos, her ex-boyfriend, who, to this day, remains at large. The death certificate of my sister recorded suffocation as the cause of her passing. Liliana's Invincible Summer grew out of these many years of pain and forced silencing, years of breathlessness, in which those of us who loved Liliana found ourselves quite often at loss for words and air. Sadly, this story is more common than you'd expect, and not only in countries such as Mexico or Honduras, where data reveals that an average of 11 women are killed daily because they are women, for reasons of gender, as it reads in the Mexican Penal Code of 2012. But also in countries such as in the United States, where in 2018, according to official data, 3 women were killed by their intimate partners every single day, with numbers growing during the pandemic. Last week, I learned in a conversation similar to this one at the Instituto Cervantes in Berlin, the data for Germany is not far off. It's very similar. Back in the 1990s, and even today, many of these stories were told, if at all, according to the precepts of patriarchal narrative of the passionate crime, a legal and popular culture figure that implicitly blames the victim and exonerates the perpetrator. According to historians Lisette Griselda Rivera, Reinaldos, and Saidi Núñez Medina, shared notions of male honor as well as the belief that men overcome by ranging emotions are besides themselves and therefore not responsible for their actions. This belief has prompted judges to issue minimal or no sentences at all for these crimes, which has historically undermined and perpetuated the impact of violence on women's lives, at least since the early 19th century. So the dead girl's story, on the other hand, a genre all of its own in the United States, and I believe in the English-speaking world altogether, populated by puzzling monsters and random, often unexpected bouts of aggression, has proven equally effective in increasing social tolerance for women's suffering. And I want you to know right now in the description that I just offered to you that in both of these storytelling machines, the concept of femicide is conspicuously absent. While the expression has existed in English since at least the early 19th century and likewise indicates the killing of women, many seem to struggle with its nomenclature even today. The term, however, became somewhat widespread during the 1970s, echoing assertions against female oppression. Proceedings of the International Tribunal on Crimes Against Women indicate that feminist author Diana Russell first employed the term femicide in Belgium in 1976. Femicide, which alerts us to the structural nature of this crime, forcing accountability on both patriarchy and its players, has introduced a bout of air in practices and narratives that have forced us to hold our breath for so long. More recently, translator Max Granger has suggested the use of the word femicider, akin to the word femicida in Espanol, to clearly distinguish those killers who target and kill women because they are women. As with all words, this one comes with history and conflict, with baggage. Here I'm quoting Max Granger, the translator. On the one hand, translator can erase the more radical meanings of words in service of readability and the rules of a given language. On the other, it can work to faithfully represent those meanings when we find creative ways to allow the source language to influence and change the target language, and thus perhaps to change how we think and act in the language. So, I'm using all these breathing and long-related terminology today as discussed by Christina Sharpe in Chapter 4 of In the Wake on Blackness and Being, a book that, by the way, I don't get tired of recommending, arguing alongside her that the archives of breathlessness are repositories of those junctures in which the state chokes life out of targeted bodies, black bodies, and women bodies, among others, conforming and legitimizing a weather that comprises, and here I'm quoting Christina Sharpe, the totality of environments, the total climate of racism and misogyny. These are the archives where the innumerable "I cannot breathe" uttered by black bodies, uttered perhaps by Liliana as well, are contained. But whether Sharpe reminds us is too, and here I'm quoting her, the atmospheric condition of time and place that produces new ecologies. And that's why I now turn to breath. Uy. I'm missing one. Sorry. Oh, this is it. This is the one. It is breath I want to turn to, says Christina Sharpe at one point in her discussion on weather as a total climate. And I do it now to remind ourselves that while archives have historically been a site of power, comprised mostly by documents of the victors, they also contain, if only by necessity at times, the papers where the quoted language of the popular sectors of society, of the poor and the dispossessed, has survived. As any researcher with archival experience knows, it is possible to read documents of power against the grain, forcing them to speak as in a twisted reflection about the conditions that may have questioned that power and undermined that power in the first place. As I was writing my first novel, No One Will See Me Cry, Nadie Me Verá Llorar en español, during the last 5 years of the 20th century, wow, I say that 5 years, last 5 years of the 20th century, and I'm reminded that time really flies, oh my gosh. Okay. I read the medical files of the General Insane Asylum La Castañeda, a large public institution, less to figure out the emergence of modern psychiatry in post-revolutionary Mexico, and more to unearth the tense, volatile exchange between inmates, they were not yet called patients, and aspiring psychiatrists, their standing closely depending on the ability to ensure the mental health of those inmates, which took place in the poorly equipped rooms of a rapidly decaying institution. Just as in records of jails or orphanages, the language of illiterate men and women emerged there in the form of quotes, which, according to Walter Benjamin, accorded them a way into history and constitute, therefore, a form of redemption. Before I thought about the possibility of writing Liliana's story, I was trying to reopen a case that had laid dormant at the archives of the General Attorney's Office for about 30 years. Early during my search for Liliana's criminal case in Mexico City, I realized in utter despair that I might not be able to locate the file. Documents are routinely expunged, an employee informed me nonchalantly, almost in passing, detonating a reaction that has brought me all the way to here, to Berlin. I realized that in order to safeguard the memory of my younger sister, in order to defend my dad, I would have to recreate the file that the state bureaucracy had either destroyed or disposed of or mishandled. On January 9th, 2020, just a couple of months before the pandemic precluded any kind of travel, I flew into Mexico City and then drove to my parents' house looking for the cardboard boxes where I knew we had stored Liliana's belongings. My aim was rather humble. I was after an address book, any piece of information that might have led us to Liliana's friends from back then, 30 years earlier. It was a daunting task. Instead, I came across her own personal archive, a series of personal documents, including but not limited to letters, diaries, notebooks, blueprints, even inscribed napkins. These were not state documents, tethered to fixed identities and civil duties, but material evidence of the affective life of my sister, a bodily experience lived in a community that, while shaped by the weight of both state and capital, had clearly transcended the rich. Organized according to a system we now may ascribe to social platforms such as Facebook or Twitter, Liliana seemingly collected every little piece of writing she ever attempted. If it had affected her, she preserved it. If it affected others, she kept it. As many teenagers, Liliana inscribed herself in innumerable mediums. Collecting and preserving the evidence of these many inscriptions is what made her rather unique or unusual. Could these affective documents help me bring Liliana back from the bureaucratic oblivion into the memory of her present? If patriarchy and its players, this femicider, have been able to choke life out of Liliana, could these papers help me to infuse that life back? The term in English is insufflation. From the Latin insufflare, literally meaning to blow into, insufflation is the act of blowing something, such as gas, powder, or vapor, into a body cavity. Could Liliana's affective archive be able to insufflate air back into her life? That was my question. And this is kind of the answer that I came up with. While punctuation is rooted in oral practice, there are at least 3 systems routinely taught at universities: the breath and pause system, the grammatical system, and the system of rhetorical effects. It is breath I want to turn to, remember? Punctuation brings back into writing information contained in pauses, gesture, intonation. Commas, Gertrude Stein famously contended, are all about pause, reminding us of the slow speed of 19th century carriages, while periods and the short phrases they help encode accelerate the reading, and with the reading, our pulse, just like automobiles did for the 20th century. Punctuation, together with alliteration or simple repetition, may give us readers ample room for breathing, or, on the contrary, may leave us without air. I'm arguing now that in reading Liliana's papers, I was not only in the position of uncovering and thus rescuing information about her life. Rather, I was coming close, very close, to the unique breathing system she built with the tools of a writer's trade: pauses, commas, blank spaces, cap letters, colons, semicolons, among others. Reading is breathing in tandem. This idea reminded me of the work of Mexican visual artist and writer Veronica Gerber in this book, a wonderful one, by the way. I highly recommended The Meaning of Silence. In this book, Veronica drew circles of different size and color around different punctuation signs, bringing them into clear view. She contended that beneath or in between words spread this complex network of silence and sound, creating yet another layer of meaning. You can actually just go to her webpage and find these renditions. They are magnificent. They're really, really good. So, and we can see this clearly in Liliana's own punctuation. Her use of ellipses right here, there are plenty of those. For example, in this letter, indicating a pause and creating suspense, or the embodiment of no breathing room whatsoever in a text in which she connected all letters of all words in a long, convoluted, hard-to-read sentence, opening and closing itself vis-a-vis the reader's eyes. Color, folding, the nature of her own handwriting became increasingly relevant not only as sources of information, but as embodiments of her affective state. Both historical novels and documentary writing work with documents and research, but they do it each in its own unique way. On the side of fiction, historical novels may spring from or tangentially relate to real facts, but writers pride themselves, rightfully so, on the work of the imagination required to tell these stories. Usually, historical novels go to the documents for the content, the story, the character, the plot, leaving the materiality of the evidence aside, at least for a moment. On the side of nonfiction, documentary writing problematizes the relationship between fact and truth, carefully considering the role of material mediation. Obviously, the world, as you know, as in real life and in writing as well, the separation is rarely clear-cut. Facing faulty archives, even the very disappearance of the archive in some cases, critic Saidia Hartman coined the term critical fabulation, which allowed her to use both theory and imagination to fill in, and I'm quoting her here, the gaps left in the historical record. I've used the term disappropriation elsewhere to explore contemporary writing strategies keen on making other people's writings visible and even palpable in our own texts. No book is born in isolation. Our writing is already inscribed in traditions, many of them marked by conflict and dissent. When writing, we're always writing about someone else. We're always handling other people's materials, even when writing about oneself. On the other extreme of plagiarism, disappropriation is an aesthetic acknowledging the always already plural or communitarian nature of writing, an aspect best rendered visible through rewriting techniques that unearth, so to speak, layers of experiences we might call, according to the language of geology, sediments. Borrowing Catherine Yusuf's term, a term she uses, by the way, in another book I highly recommend, A Million Black Anthropocenes or None, I would say that writing is in fact desedimenting. I was mentioning earlier that no book is born in isolation, and I think I'm going to mention just a couple of the books that I had in mind, had to keep in mind in this larger conversation that surrounds Liliana's Invincible Summer. Obviously, Alexievich is there. Coming from Mexico, Elena Poniatowska published this amazing book, La Noche de Tlatelolco, describing a massacre that took place in Mexico in 1968, translated as Massacre in Mexico. I'm always thinking very closely with Teresa Cha, this visual artist and writer, and specifically about this book, in which she is continuously investigating and interrogating the very nature of language, and specifically translation. I love the work of Maggie Nelson, as many people do, but this one, Jane, this is a poetry book that she wrote describing the murder of an aunt of hers, and she told the story once again, now in a narrative form, in the Red Parts, this autobiography of a trail. More recently, I pay a lot of attention to what poet and scholar Susan Bryant says in regards to documentary writing, and this defacing the document, defacing the monument. This is specifically important for understanding migration processes in the United States. I noticed that I didn't include here the books of some Latin American writers that I truly, truly admire, but I should have included the book by Selva Almada, an Argentinian writer, recently translated into English, Dead Girls. It's a magnificent work. And at least the work by Dolores Reyes, another Argentinian, Come Tierra, also in English translation. I enthusiastically recommend both of them. There are many more, but, well, I have to continue. Yeah. I believe Liliana's Invincible Summer is not a memoir or a historical novel, but a piece of documentary writing that has used a form of cross-genre, more specifically what I've been calling the theory of the genre as a host, to breathe in tandem with Liliana's affective archive. And if we want to talk about this genre as a host theory, we can do that in the Q&A. I'm just going to continue now. All right. When I opened up the boxes that contain Liliana's effects, I was overcome by the eerie sensation of Liliana's presence beside me. Rather than a metaphor or the sultry effects of magical realism, so easily associated to all Latin American writing, by the way, the sensation was utterly material, utterly there. After all, the papers I was now handling had remained untouched by 30 years. More to the point, the last touch they had received came, most surely, from Liliana's own hand. And it was my hand now, 30 years later, reaching hers through time and across space. Geologists argue that water remembers, that soil remembers, the paper remembers. They don't say it exactly using those words, obviously. But that's what they claim, I believe, with the concept of residence time. The material traces of our existence, our presence, do not disappear immediately, taking instead years and at times millennia to vanish from Earth. And we can only remember what plastic does to our environment just to talk about these. While the stereotypical images of writers picture them in utter isolation, usually surrounded by books and looking intensely into immensity, and I think we all have seen those pictures, right? Transcendence, yeah. I believe there is no solitude in writing. Language, which is our tool as much as our climate, our energy, as well as our politics, comes to us with history and conflict in it, with experience and fury. The language I use to write books belongs rightfully to entire communities of practitioners, and it is their voices and traces I'm connected to and with as soon as I sit in front of my computer or grab a pen. Likewise, I perceive research as a work of care, searching, reading, imagining, meditating, talking with, sitting with, are but some of the forms that research takes as I write a book. In fact, I believe this is the care and the embrace I need in order to be able to say, I'm writing a book. This might as well be the weight work that Christina Sharpe alludes to when she was speaking, talking about defending our death. In Hydra Medusa, I wrote here the forthcoming book by Japanese-American poet Brandon Shimoda, Nightboat Books 2023. It turns out that the book is already there. You can order it, pre-order it, I believe. So it's not forthcoming anymore. There is a haunting reflection on the heavy bond that through impunity or wrongful acquittal unites murderers and their victims. Exploring the concept of cruentation, the theory that a corpse will begin to bleed again in the presence of the murderer, Shimoda asks, and I'm quoting him right now, what if the expression of blood from a corpse was the genesis of a curse in which a killer inherited the blood of the corpse they produced? The murderer will become the corpse's descendant, while the dead will become the murderer's ancestor. But this curse is a double-edged sword, and one edge strikes the dead with equal intensity as the living. Or does it? Could the victim and the victimizer, bound by the blood of the crime and the persistence of impunity, become separated through the curse? The dead, Shimoda writes, inherit against their will an association with the murderer that for being undying requires an act of severance. A line from the book In the Presence of Absence by poet Mahmoud Darwish offers a way out of this dilemma. In Darwish's poem, a prisoner says to his guard, "You will never be free of me unless my freedom is generous to a fault." I think you should be reading this. Sorry. Then, relieving the prisoner, but not the guard, of his burden, Darwish writes, "He who lives on depraving others of light drowns in the darkness of his own shadow." Thus, while the burden of the curse will not fall on the dead, murderers drown in the waters of their own darkness. Ancestors are not burdened any more than the light or memory is burdened. Okay, now here we go. Contrary to the murderer's desire, the life and words of Liliana Rivera Garza continue to open new paths. The attorney in charge of Mexico City's Special Prosecutor's Office for the crime of femicide, Sayuri Herrera, a lawyer whose work I really, really admire, has convincingly argued that not all justice is punitive justice. And Mexico's victims' law, la Ley General de Víctimas, includes truth and memory as acts of restitution. Every time I see the way readers embrace Liliana, I tell myself that all of us together are participating in a more expansive, perhaps even cosmic justice. The justice of having her here by force of a shared and combative memory in the present. And I tell myself that from this present, which is her future, those young readers, through an act of retrospection, are becoming my sisters and sisters, and she their descendant in the past, and vice versa. Like Shimoda in Hydra Medusa, I too have come to believe that life is a preparation for the possibility of becoming an ancestor, and this possibility materializes through vigilance, responsibility, and love. I don't want to leave this podium without sharing with you some the This comes from the International Women's Demonstration that took place in Mexico this last March. And these are pictures that people were sending me, sharing with me via Twitter or email. Just young women writing Liliana's name and keeping her name right there, alive in the streets, on the streets of Mexico City. This is another one, Justice for Liliana. I might add, I don't know these women. They're not my friends. They are now my sisters, of course, after they've gone through this process. But this is especially important. Liliana was studying at the UAM, Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana de Mexico. She was planning on becoming an architect. She was 20 years old when she was killed. And the university paid an artist to paint this mural. That's the face of my sister right there. They organized a strike not long ago, and they chose Liliana's name and this book to remind themselves that we have to unite, that there are reasons to continue. The life is always more important, is what keeps us thinking and going back and being present in our societies, in our cities, in our homes. So while you take a look at this image, I would like for Liliana to have the last word today. So I'm going to be reading a fragment of a letter she wrote many, many years ago. It is a letter that poses a question that I think it is very important to me, but in a way is a question that matters, should matter to all of us. For those of you coming from Latin America, specifically from Mexico, and those of you more or less, in my age time frame, from that generation, the phrase, it is a matter of thinking young, it is a matter of thinking positively, a matter of focus. You might be reminded of an ad. La cosa es pensar joven, pensar positivamente, es cuestión de enfoques, right? I'm mentioning this because it's something that Liliana is quoting right here in the first paragraph. So those of us old enough will be remembering. And so I'm just trying to explain to you the context in which this phrase was written right here. She wrote, "This is the last page of my notebook. Well, the first one from back to front. You know what I mean? Depending on how you look at it, because it is a matter of thinking young. It is a matter of thinking positively, a matter of focus. Don't you like that ad? Well, I do. So what? Well, nothing. I'm in such a completely lazy mood, and I am very sleepy too. And when you suffer from those two conditions, but nevertheless, you also have an aversion to sleep during wake hours, there is this very big shock. And do you know what happens? Well, in addition to sleepiness and laziness, a very funny foolishness crops up. That is happening to me right now. So much so that you even feel like sitting down or laying down or kneeling just about anywhere. And then it just so happens that you inevitably start thinking, and you turn to look at the clock and the wall, and you think that your mother is going to arrive soon, and that you have to pay your school's tuition bill, and that today you did not see Angel, and you don't feel like training. You also think that you no longer want to train, because when you are not in a quiet environment, it is impossible for you to develop your concentration and full physical potential. And you think that your exams are almost here, and above all, you worry but your worry is not that big, not big enough for you to get up, grab your notebook, and study, right? Well, something similar happens when you are like this, because it is something exactly like that, huh? And if you don't know how to express what you are thinking, then something happens that seems very strange to you. It is something like wondering if you really are the one who is writing, as if, and suddenly, as if by magic, you remember a dream. I don't know when I had it. And as soon as it arrives, it just goes away and you forget it. And you are even more sleepy now, and more. And ouch, your back itches. You scratch with fury because it bothers you that you cannot scratch comfortably. Geez. And you wonder why they put so much chlorine in the pool. It makes my skin so very dry. And dryness is not the worst, but what dry skin gives off, itching. So you keep on thinking about the swimming pool and the chlorine, which in addition to the itching, leaves a characteristic smell of the so-called substance whose chemical symbol is Cl. And then you remember your chemistry class and something else as a result, but it is nauseating and you prefer to leave it in peace. Peace, damn. What if there was peace? What if there were no people starving in the world? What if there was justice? What if people really appreciated other people for who they are and not for what they look like or their image? What if I fell asleep? What if you knew what would become of me? So that was a question. Thank you.
So I would like to start. I like the idea of literature as forensics.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I have to really recommend you to read the book, because it is a great literary pleasure, not only a forensic pleasure in advancing, coming to know more about the truth. So I wanted to ask you to take up your hint on the genre issue, the literary genre issue, because it's connected to literature as forensics. The book is constructed as a detective novel. You are a sort of detective in the novel. So why are you choosing this dimension of this genre of literature? If this is the genre you're going to want to host, maybe you were using another genre and I didn't get the clue.
No, it's very interesting. Unfortunately, with these kind of stories, what happens is that we know the story very well. We've been told this story innumerable times. Sadly, most of these times, the story has been told from the point of view of dominant thought, patriarchy, to go to the point, right? So facing that big challenge, what I wanted to do was to subvert that narrative, to throw questions precisely to that narrative. And in order to do so, I had to move away, slowly but surely, from pure fiction. And I had to incorporate the richness of the archive, specifically because I had access to that, as I was explaining in the presentation. It gave me the possibility of touching upon issues of materiality that I believe are incredibly relevant to contemporary discussions, not only in terms of literature, but as we've been exposed to and conversing about in these presentations here at the American Academy, in a range of fields. So I think that just having access to these documents, to the letters, some of those you were able to see here on the screen, provided me with an aesthetic challenge. So it was just not a matter of telling a story that we know so well. It was a matter of how to subvert that story, to be able to escape that dominant narrative and move into a new territory, while at the same time touching upon issues that are very important to me and very dear to my heart as well. So what I mentioned earlier about paying this very close attention to issues like punctuation, like the kind of writing that Liliana was attempting, I took that as my own instructions, my prompts, so to speak. So if I wanted to be close to Liliana, it was not enough to tell the story. Because again, sadly, we know the story. We know how it ends, right? So what I wanted to do was to keep the distance that archives allow us to keep, but at the same time get into this realm of radical closeness, which is another of a huge virtue of archival work as well. So I wanted to work in the intersection of both of them. And so I had some problems when thinking about the book, as I was reminded earlier of this Polish poet, Dicky, contemporary poet, and that once in trying to explain her position vis-a-vis language, he said, I'm a contemporary poet, I have a complicated relationship with language. So I was thinking, well, I'm a contemporary writer and I have a complicated relationship with fiction, obviously, right? So I've been moving quite freely at times between fiction and nonfiction. And what I realized is that what really mattered to me is that at one point, one of these big genres became sort of a host. So fiction was the kind of embrace that allowed in, that welcomed other types of writing, what we call crónica in Latin America, personal essay writing, travel writing, among others. And depending on the project and depending on the book, I think the host genre was changing, it was switching, but the relationship, which was very active and very lively, I think remained the same. And that to me is what really matters at this point. At least that was the status of my own investigation, exploration in terms of literature and the limits and potency too of both fiction and nonfiction at the same time.
Being trained as a sociologist and being a historian, was it hard to choose the I, to choose the first person, to write from the I?
Well, I have to confess, Sylvia, that before I studied, I did my bachelor's in Mexico City at the UNAM in sociology, and then my PhD in history in the United States. But before I did all that, I was writing books, and in fact, my decision to enroll in these programs, I've been optimistic at times in my life, and so I thought that in order for me to become a better writer, it would be on my own benefit to get the handle on other types of other kinds of methods and other ways of approaching the complexities of our world. So the short answer is no. I didn't have a problem at all with using the I. The I came. I mean, I do believe that every single piece of writing, when it is truthful and when it comes from the right place, is personal writing. That doesn't mean that it is telling your specific story or anyone else's story, but it comes from a place of. From this enigmatic place that at least in my case, that's what I'm trying to follow. There is something that I know, but there is much that I don't know, and that's what keeps me going. So I've been using as many pronouns as I can. The I, as such, has become a site of much discussion rightfully so. I've sometimes used the we, which is also complicated, but I do so very aware of the history that they bring with them, of the conflict, of the challenges that they pose to not only to writing, I mean to our understanding of what we do, with each other in society.
I would very much like to encourage you to make questions, because we have like quarter, like 15 minutes for the conversation. And while you raise your hands, or you think if you're going to dare to make a question, please do so. I would like to go further into detail into the language question, because there is this dimension of fabulation and of field work that produces materiality that you digest and transform, but there is also a permanent mode of translation in your work, of translation between theory and literary practice, between English and Spanish, between poetry and theory. So is that also a political mode? Is translation a political mode for you? Or is this a way of being is this a goal, or is this a way of being in life?
Yeah, that's interesting too. I have to say that a little bit of both. Obviously, that's a typical answer of the historian. A bit of both. I was born on the border on the U.S.-Mexico border, and then I lived by choice on the other side of the U.S.-Mexico border, between San Diego and Tijuana. So I cannot tell you in just a couple of sentences how relevant that lived experience has been. I come from whole generations of migrants who've been crossing the U.S.-Mexico border for ages. So that has been not only, it's ingrained in my DNA in many ways, and it's pretty much the lens through which I perceive the world. But many writers and many people live and are born on borders, and that doesn't mean that they have to choose, to select a political stance about that. And so in many ways, for me, the translation mode that I've been adopting, it is a decision, and it is a tough choice. And it very much structures many of my stands, many of which are political, of course. So, yeah, I'm always thinking. I'm only bilingual, so I kind of think in 3 or 4 languages. I'm mostly thinking in between Spanish and English. I don't speak any indigenous language, Mexican language, sadly. But everything I write, I think I write from this, what I've been calling translation mode. I don't use what Chicano writers use very successfully and in a very interesting way during the 20th century. The code switching and books that really, really interesting to me and foundational in many ways. But I think you could see the merging and the negotiating between these languages, mostly in sentence structure and just the general arranging of sentences in one language and in the other. And these, which might be just a technicality, I think there's a lot of politics about that. After all, the way in which we arrange words, the way in which we place emphasis on, nouns and verbs, are political issues, are allowing and silencing people's histories and perspectives into writing and into the public spheres in many ways. So both. Yes.
Not only but also.
Not only but also. Yeah, we continue with that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Please.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. My name is Caroline Fetter. I just wondered, you say that femicide is a universal problem.
Yeah.
And I wonder what you say about feminism. How universal is feminism? Because we've got a debate about this at the moment. Is feminism black or post-colonial, or are white feminists not allowed to say anything about universal problems, etc.?
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder how you relate to the idea of universal feminism.
Mm-hmm. Well, I couldn't have written this book without the struggle of many feminist movements and without the struggles of women's mobilizations in general. Many of them have been feminist mobilizations, some of them have not, and yet I think all of them are equally relevant. And specifically related to this case, I think it's incredibly relevant the work that these mobilizations have done in terms of producing a language that right now is allowing me, in particular, but us, generally speaking, as a society, to tell these stories in ways that escape the mainstream patriarchal narrative. So I do describe myself, of course, as a feminist writer. Fortunately, we have a range of feminisms. And in between them, we have dissent, we have different perspectives. I think that dissent is incredibly relevant if we want to keep a critical stand, a critical view about the way in which bodies relate in our contemporary societies. So if there is any chance that we have a future, I think that future is related to the power of these many feminisms that are allowing us to think in critical, radical ways about the present and the future too. Yeah.
Thank you, Cristina, for the amazing presentation and analytics and affective presentation that you gave to us. I know that you mentioned Catherine Yusuf's book, A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None. And then I think in the next slide you reminded us that the soil remembers, the water remembers, the paper remembers. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask you to think out loud a little bit more about the importance of the material world and how you would juxtapose that to the representational world. Yeah. Or the world of discourse and text, and how those are different or similar in how you see it.
No, thank you so much for that question, Simone. I began writing books many years ago, by the way, as I mentioned, the late 20th century, thinking that I was writing fiction, these works of the imagination. And then very soon, though, I realized that I was, from the very beginning, to writing very closely to the material evidence coming from an archive and using tons of imagination to do that work, too. So I didn't see any difference between that line that very often we use to separate fiction and nonfiction, as though imagination belongs to just one side and not to the other. So that, to me, was very clear from the beginning. But the other thing that became increasingly important as I continued writing was the kind of detours and the kind of questions that came with the materiality of archives and documents. So these were questions as practical and simple as, if you want to do research in an archive, you have to travel. Your body has to move, right? And if you're going to be doing research for a long time, you need some kind of funding, right? So you're going to be in a very complex, uneven relationship with different institutions, right? And then once you get to the documents, there is a mediation of the archivists. I mean, if people working in these archives don't like you, you're dead. You're not going to get anything. So there's all this human negotiation taking place too. And then once we get to the document as such, there is the information, the level of the information, and to me, increasingly relevant, the other level, the materiality of the language that I was having access to. So I was continuously throwing questions about all these many mediations that allow me to, but kind of slowed down also the way in which I could approach the realities that kind of bugged me and that I was obsessed with, but I didn't know exactly what they were. That's the reason why I was writing about them too. So that's been the source of much of that of many of these questions, and answering them requires a lot of work, right? There might be easy, just very basic kind of questions, but the territory that they take us into, to me, is just fascinating. I'm now in a position, I cannot think of writing anything without paying close attention to the relationship, for example, between territories and bodies. And once we get there, we are into very complex and politically charged relationships as well. So I think all of that comes as a result, all of these and more, of course, comes as a result of going through the experience, of having a body that has gone through that experience and thinking, bodily thinking about what is in our hands, what is it that we are touching, and what kind of experience can we share, therefore, with others once that touch is gone. Yeah? Okay.
I see 3 more questions, and I would suggest to collect them all so that we see all the dimensions that open.
Okay.
Yeah. So I have one on there and here and there. Yeah.
Yeah, Cristina, you might have answered that already with the last question's answer a little bit. I'm really curious about modes of engagement and incorporation with regard to that specific archive for this book, because you referenced it as mediation. So I'm interested in archival gaps and silences, and of course, as the one who engages with archival documents, materials, there's a selection process taking place, and the way in which you incorporate it in your book, the way you place them in relationship to the writing that you're doing within the book. So I was wondering, I mean, we talked a little about these aspects, and this book was a long process for you to write also. So I would be curious also if your relationship and your engagement with these documents also changed over time, obviously also returning to them. And I can imagine the process to decide what to include in what form might have also changed. And so I'm curious just to hear a little more about that with regard to this specific book.
Yeah. Wow, what a question. Okay, I'll try to be brief. Thank you for asking that question, Ella. When I got access to these documents, as I mentioned earlier, they were in Mexico. So first of all, I had to take them with me back to Texas, to the United States. So I only put them in a piece of luggage and took them with me. And once I got there to my home in Houston, I went through the process of not only reading them, each one of them, but transcribing each one of them as well. I wanted to have the bodily experience of going through each one of these sentences or phrases, because many of them were not sentences, right? So they were not in any kind of order, chronological order, or they were just there, stored in the box. So trying to discern, impose, in a way, that order took a long time as well. So for a while, not only my study, but my home became just a repository of all these documents. They were overflowing. They were all over the place. I had them, on my desk, and then on the floor, and then little by little, they were occupying more space in my dining room and the living room. And so it was a good thing that I finished writing that book. Otherwise, we would have been outside of that home immediately. But and then for a moment, I thought about the possibility of actually just publishing the documents as such, with all the silences, with all the holes, right? The porosity of each one of them. And I still toy at times with that idea. I think it would be good just to offer the raw experience to the reader as such. When I began writing this book, the amount of letters included in the book was way more. I wanted to have Liliana's voice pretty much dominating the whole discussion. And then it took time negotiating with editors and agents and friends and readers just to choose among all these many documents the ones that really helped me not only make the case, but also that helped the book as such, the structure of the book. So in a way, what I decided to do was to follow Liliana's instructions, Liliana's own way of writing, and try to honor these instructions. So I didn't want to speak for her. I didn't want to speak over her. I didn't want to editorialize her. I didn't want to project my present tense on her. It was a very slippery terrain. And I think bringing those specific letters into the book helped me at least to have a sense of something that could become, I was going to say a sense of control, but control is not the word that I'm looking for. It could be a sense that this was something shareable, right? And so those were the things that I had in mind. And obviously, very often, as I continue talking with my sister's friends, and entire chapters of this book are based on the interviews that I conducted with them. I came to know many Lilianas, right? I was her sister in life, and I knew her as a sister, but I was not her best friend in the university. I was not a boy in love with her. So I came to know this other Liliana, and I came to much closer to her great sense of humor, for example. I knew that she was humorous, but I didn't know that she was that ironic, for example. So just getting to know her in these different ways also allow me to develop certain kind of standards, or allow me to make certain decisions about what to include and what to leave out of the book as such. Very often, to be honest, a decision-making process consisted of listening to Liliana's voice behind my back saying, "Oh no, you are not going to write that. That's too cheesy. I'm not like that at all." And so it was, in a way, a conversation, and based on the relationships that I was becoming part of as I talked to friends and family members about her. Yeah.
Okay, I promised to take 2 more questions.
Yeah.
So, I want to keep my promise before we invite.
Thank you very much, Cristina, for all what you spoke in your conference and now the answers. I'm all the time thinking something, but it might be a bit personal. I think what you show us is an extremely complex process of mourning, but I don't know, you never mentioned the word mourning.
Yeah.
Because you speak so much about archive and documentation and coming closer and the documents and the materials. Can you say a word about it?
Yeah,
or
sure. I kind of alluded to that when I mentioned the wake work, this concept that Christina Sharpe uses in such a generative way in the book that I mentioned, In the Wake. And years before I started to write this book, I published a book precisely on pain and mourning. It's called Dolerse in Spanish. So this is a topic that I've been preoccupied with and really thinking through for a long, long time. At the time of writing that book, It was about 2008, 2011. I thought I was mostly thinking about the terrible spread of violence in Mexico, the misnamed war on drugs that so much affected the lives of just everyday citizens in Mexico. And I was trying to come to terms precisely with a notion of a social mourning. I now believe that I was not only thinking about Mexico and this specific time and place, I was also going through my own very personal process. And but I was trying to think through not only the I and the personal, but I was trying to put that together with larger experiences and larger notions about, the communities that get affected and that respond to this kind of violence. So, in fact, one of the phrases of the book is that we cannot mourn in the I. In order to go through this process, this is something that we can only do with others. This is something that, as writing itself, we do in community. And so, in many ways, even though I didn't know this back at that time, I was already writing Liliana's Invincible Summer, but in a very different register. Yeah.
And now the very last question.
Hi, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
I'm wondering about the breathing as or the lack of breathing as an atmospherical phenomenon, and how we can be sort of configured in terms of because there's many people that are marginalized from that togetherness of air, I think, that are people that suffer from lack of breathing more than others.
Of course.
And I think it relates a lot with Yusef and the materiality of air, and it's just something. I mean, if you could say something, perhaps is out of the
No. That helps me a lot, and in fact, that's what I was trying to get at. I have been just obsessed with this documentation, and I knew I will write. I was about to write something about it, and I was trying to locate why this is so relevant for me. In a way, trying to get back to your question about materiality, right? I mean, of course, I was able to unearth information that I didn't know before. I was able to get clues that kind of drive the detective side of the story. But more important than that was that closeness that at the very beginning was not that clear to me. That bodily proximity, and this that at the beginning was, or I felt as an eerie presence, became. I had to acknowledge that it was not that eerie, or that it was eerie in any case because it was that present, right? So just trying to come to terms with that sensation was relevant personally for me, but it was also, aesthetically, was also very important because what I wanted to do in this book, I wanted to take people to that precise point in time, to the sharing part. So we know the story. I was not going to be able to tell you the story any other way. You knew how this story was going to end from the very beginning of the book. But what I believe could have made a difference in terms of the telling of the story was precisely that moment, of the heaviness of the presence. And so the challenge for me was what can I do with my very humble tools? The humble and very powerful tools of language. What can I do to share this experience? I was not that interested in telling the story, but the sharing of the experience. And so that's when the whole breathing system, it was not a metaphor, it was something that I came very close to, that came in handy, so to speak. But more than useful, it became a kind of this this atmosphere that allow me to go through the story and to move with language, to work with language in ways that I was not expecting, and in ways that related very much to the bodily presence that I was able to get in touch with because of that very humble basic of strategies, right? Punctuation signs. So just thinking about that. Obviously, as discussed by Sharpe in this chapter 4, a wonderful book, but this chapter 4 is especially good. I mean, obviously, breathing is not distributed equally in the world, and suffocation and the "I cannot breathe" that we've heard so often prompt us, at least force me to ask, to place this morning in a larger arena and to interrogate the system that allows that to happen, allows that to become the dominant mode of existence. So we go from the very carnal to the very political in the same move, and I think that's very relevant.
Thank you very much,
Okay.
Cristina Rivera Garza.